restorers. Welcome to this episode of the Restoration Today podcast. I am just excited to have a repeat guest here. I am joined by Dr. Phil Klotzbach, who is with Colorado State. He's a senior research scientist. He works in the Department of Atmospheric Science. Hopefully you've heard him on the show before. He and his team come up with all the hurricane and storm predictions, and we happen to be talking in a really interesting place in the hurricane season because forecast came out early and it was going to be a killer of a season. We had some really early storms, some record-setting things at the beginning of the season, and now we're in this weird window of what is going to happen. So I'm excited to have Phil back on the podcast to kind of chat about what he is seeing, what his team's seeing, kind of what they think, don't know, whatever that may be. So Dr. Klotzbach, welcome back. I'm going to toss it over to you to kind of introduce yourself a little bit first for people who are just joining us for the first time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michelle. It's great to be back on. I'm Phil Klotzbach. I work as you mentioned, I'm working in the Department of Atmospheric Science at CSU. So our group is best known for its seasonal and subseasonal hurricane predictions. I had the pleasure of working alongside Dr. Bill Gray, who was the originator of the seasonal forecast back in the early 1980s, the first year that our group at CSU put out a seasonal forecast was all the way back in 1984. So this is year number 41 of seasonal forecasts from CSU. And the fact that we're still doing it and people still pay attention indicates we do have some skill. Now, there's some years where we bust, but in general, the forecasts verify reasonably well. So when we forecast below normal activity, it happens to be below, and you forecast above normal, it happens to be above. And the way that we do these forecasts is we use a lot of historical weather and climate data. So we know which years in the past were busy hurricane seasons. We know which years in the past had warm Atlantics, cold Atlantics, whether we had El Nino, which is warmer water in the central and eastern tropical Pacific, whether we had El Nino, didn't have El Nino. We know that pretty well going back 40 to 50 years. So we build a lot of our models based on historical weather and climate data. So when a certain set of climate conditions occur in, say, May, June, typically that means a busy season or it means a quiet season. But kind of like you see when you invest, they always say past performance is not a guarantee of future results. In general, yes, it does work, but there are some years where you only have so many realizations of the atmosphere-ocean system and things can play out very differently than you expect. So it remains to be seen how 2024 will verify. We're August 27th is when we're recording this. So typically the season really ramps up in mid-August. So this is about the time you would be expecting to see a lot of storm activity. And right now we have no storms. There's a potential for some stuff forming in about 5 to 7 days, but it's not real clear. So it kind of remains to be seen how the season's going to play out. About half of all your activity historically occurs in September. So that's normally when we would really expect to see a lot of storms, especially given the forecast.
Yes. Okay. So what kind of indicators were you seeing coming into hurricane season that led you to predict that maybe this was going to be a crazy hurricane season?
Yeah. So one of the biggest ones was the Atlantic was and is still near record warm. So it's kind of running neck and neck with last year, depending on exactly where you look. And those warmer waters provide more fuel for hurricanes. And when you have, and it also tends to lower the pressure, make for a more unstable atmosphere, tends to also basically reduce levels of vertical wind shear, which is that change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere. Too much shear is detrimental for hurricane formation and intensification. So when you have lower levels of shear, that is more conducive for hurricanes. So that's kind of one of the big things that we saw. Another was we were trending towards La Nina, which is colder than normal water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific. That also tends to reduce your levels of vertical wind shear in the Atlantic basin. So that kind of in combination really got us thinking that we were going to see an extremely busy season. As you also noted earlier on, we had Hurricane Beryl in late June into early July. And normally early season storms don't really correlate with the rest of the season, but when you get very powerful hurricanes, say in the tropical Atlantic, Eastern Caribbean, that is typically a harbinger of a very, very busy season. If we look back historically at those years, they're some of the busiest years on record, and Beryl was the earliest calendar year Category 5 in the Atlantic on record. It was the strongest July hurricane on record in the Atlantic. So it set all these records. So kind of reinforcing that we were likely headed for an extremely busy year. We had 2 hurricanes in August and things were kind of clipping along. And then about a week ago, it just sputtered to a halt. And so that is kind of the big question is this just kind of a temporary blip? Or is this, something crazy happening and we're just not going to see the levels of storm activity that were predicted? And that's, I guess we'll know the answer to that question in about 6 to 8 weeks.
We will. Is there anything that changed in the tropics over the last like week or so that made it just go whoop?
Yeah, I mean, so, one of the big things is that, normally, and again, it's hard to say because we don't really know how the season's going to play out. It could still end up being very, very busy, and, this will just be a short-term blip. But a couple of things that have really changed. The water temperatures are still really hot, and the shear has been very low, both of which tend to lead towards a very busy season. But we've had a lot of dry air come into the tropical Atlantic, and that dry air has really squelched thunderstorm activity. If you look at the satellite loop today, you're starting to see a little bit of it, but a few days ago there were almost no thunderstorms in the tropical Atlantic, which is just really not usual for mid-August. And so when you have a lot of dry air and stable air, it squelches the thunderstorms that are the building blocks of the hurricanes. So the big question is, will that kind of go away? Is this kind of a short-term blip, or will that persist? Again, the season really is ramping up now climatologically, or on average, and peaks around September 10th. So, if the season's going to verify, storms are going to have to start coming in here fairly quickly. Now, if you look historically, we've seen all sorts of crazy things where we've seen, really busy early seasons, then nothing, and then busy late seasons, and it ends up above average some in a strange way. Or, but it would be extremely unusual to find a year like this year where it was you get a powerful hurricane early on, especially in the deep tropics, and then have it overall end up, say, being an average season. Now, given how much kind of wind energy Beryl has already generated for this year, the odds of it not being at least a normal season are extremely low, just given we don't need very much storm activity the rest of the way to make normal. And even if we were average the rest of the way, we'd still make above normal, just because Beryl was a long-lived Category 5, in the way that NOAA assesses hurricane seasons is based on a wind metric, which is kind of an integrated metric of overall storm frequency, intensity, and longevity. So when you get a super long-lived Category 5 hurricane, that generates a ton of that metric that we call accumulated cyclone energy. So the odds of the season ending up below normal are still basically zero. Normal are still pretty low, but maybe it'll just end up being above normal, as opposed to the hyperactive season that our group and everybody else was forecasting. Now, a week from now, we may have this very conversation. There may be 2 hurricanes already in the Atlantic, and we'd be saying, oh, who knew? But again, that's kind of what happens when you do these things in late August. You really don't know quite how things are going to play out.
Yep, that is true. I'm curious, hopefully this isn't a stupid question, but what is the difference? Is there a big difference between storms in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic versus in the Pacific? I feel like we don't, as Americans, we don't pay so much attention to stuff happening in the Pacific because Hawaii's there, but otherwise it's going the other way, not usually coming toward, continental mainland US. But is there a difference?
I mean, they're the same in that they a hurricane is a hurricane, it's a typhoon in the Western North Pacific, but they do form from a little bit different mechanisms. Okay. So the Eastern North Pacific, so off the west coast of Mexico, so you may remember Hurricane Otis last year. Yep. Oftentimes those will actually form from what we call easterly waves, or those thunderstorm complexes that come off of Africa. Some will form in the Atlantic, some just go all the way across the Caribbean and then cross Central America and then form in the Eastern North Pacific. You can also get storms kind of spinning up more, and there's this area kind of low-level area of rotation where sometimes we'll get storms called like the monsoon trough or the intertropical convergence zone. You'll sometimes get storms forming there, especially as you shift gears more towards the Western North Pacific. But whether it's called a typhoon, hurricane, a cyclone, they're all the same thing. Just in the Southern Hemisphere, they spin clockwise as opposed to counterclockwise.
Okay, that was the mechanics were what I was curious about. Like, do they form a little bit differently? Are water temperatures a little bit different because the oceans are different?
Yes, and so there are some differences in mechanisms too. So the Atlantic is it's the water temperatures, especially in the eastern part, are kind of marginal. So that's one of the reasons why we focus a lot on water temperatures in the Atlantic. Yeah. And say the Western North Pacific, it's ridiculously hot. You don't have any water temperature issues. It's more how those water temperatures are structured that kind of changes the circulation to kind of impact the shear. Also, again, that monsoon trough, sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's weak. If it's strong, that's when you usually have a lot of storms. When it's weak, you tend to get fewer. So there are different mechanisms. So when you're predicting hurricanes in the Atlantic versus, like, say, the Western North Pacific, on a seasonal time scale, you would use definitely different sets of predictors. So in the Atlantic, La Nina, which is colder water in eastern and central tropical Pacific, knocks down our shear, makes for busier seasons. In the Pacific Ocean, both the eastern and western North Pacific, La Nina tends to actually knock down your storm activity. You tend to get more storms there in El Nino because of kind of how it changes the atmospheric circulation. So the Atlantic and Pacific very roughly tend to kind of go opposite of each other, especially the Eastern North Pacific when that's busy, like it has been or is right now. The Atlantic tends to be quiet and vice versa. So another reason why we think the Atlantic's about to pick up is those storms in the Eastern North Pacific are all about to die. So that means the Atlantic should pick up the slack and start doing some stuff.
Should pick up the slack. I like it. Pick up the slack. So what do you tell people? I mean, you were saying even if we have a few more storms, we're at an average year or maybe an above average year, which is so interesting to think about because it started so early. It seems like it's been quiet when it really hasn't been because it started so early. So what do you tell people who are like, oh man, this is kind of a bust of a hurricane season when really it's not because it started early, right?
Yeah, and it's one of those things where Beryl feels like last year because it was so long ago, but it was part of this year's hurricane season. And so when you're doing the seasonal forecast, that does include storms that form in June and does include storms that form in November. And, again, there's been a lot of discussion over the last few days. A lot of media, I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of reporters asking about it. And a fair question. This is when the season's supposed to be busy. Even in an average season, we should have storms now. But if you look back historically, a lot of busy seasons have had weird 10-day, 2-week times where not much has happened. We saw that in 2020 when we had 30 storms. We broke the record for most storms in a season. We still had about a 10-day window in late September, which normally is busy, where we had 0. And, we were doing a forecast for the end of this October, November, and I agonized over it, said, what's going to happen? This is really we don't really know. And yet October, November had 6 hurricanes, which is the most and 5 major hurricanes, which is the most on record by a factor of over. The prior record was 2. We had 5, and it was like you still couldn't really see it. So seasonal forecasts have skill, but there are a lot of challenges because you're trying to forecast weather events on long-term timescales, and so weird things can happen, and you can't take into account every single little thing. So if you were to show me the current sea surface temperatures and the current shear, I would say the Atlantic should be going bananas, and yet we have nothing. So it just kind of goes to show, even when you have perfect knowledge of these things that work really well, sometimes other stuff can come into the mix, like this dry air that we've been getting has been, really surprising, just given normally when you have a very vigorous monsoon over West Africa like we've had. Normally that means strong waves coming off the coast, but it's been so strong. The waves have been coming off too far north. They've been coming off almost in the Sahara, as opposed to further south. So they're bringing in all this dry air and not being able to form because they're coming off into really cold water. So it's almost like we have too much of a good thing if you're looking for hurricanes at this point. But with time, where those systems come off Africa does shift south over the course of September into October. So we do think that will also probably lead it to get busier. Again, obviously it's easier to say it's going to get busier when you have nothing, and it is the peak of the season. We guarantee we'll have a storm in September. Whether we have 1 or 8, it remains to be seen. But I think it'll be closer. Yeah, I think it'll be closer to the high number than the low number.
Okay. All right. That's fair. So what does your team, I know that you have a cadence for your predictions coming out. So I think it starts in April and then you had maybe June, July, August. Mm-hmm. Are there any more predictions coming or formally?
Yeah. So we don't, so our seasonal forecasts are done. We don't do any more seasonal forecasts, but we do issue 2-week forecasts where we try to predict during the season how busy it's going to be. So the first 2-week forecast we put out August 6th, verified well. We said above normal. We had Debbie and Ernesto, and it was above normal. And then the last one we really agonized over, and we ended up going with normal. That's not going to verify, barring some sort of craziness. It'll very likely be below unless storms get formed a little faster than the models are saying. And then we'll put out another forecast on September 3rd for the next 2 weeks. So at this point, anything goes. I have no idea what we'll be saying then. We'll have to see what happens. Things change very quickly this time of year. And if I were to show you some graphics of what models were saying 2 days ago versus yesterday versus today, it's very, very volatile. And we'll get some new model runs right after this podcast is done, and we'll see what happens. So stuff is very volatile, which means I think the forecast skill for the next week to 10 days is probably quite low. So I could see it where we have 3 storms in the next week, or maybe we have 0. And it's hard to say. We don't have, sometimes models are very consistent and you get a really good signal. But even a storm like Beryl was a category 5 hurricane, strongest hurricanes we can get in the Atlantic. And the models were kind of all over the place. They didn't have a lot of signal until about a week in advance. So, you can models can miss a Cat 5, a few days in advance. It just depends on some storms. They do great. Some storms they don't do well. So we'll see what transpires here in the next week. I think some of the challenge with the Atlantic too is that the systems that form our hurricanes come off of Africa. And Africa generally don't have a lot. We have satellite data, but we don't have a lot of weather balloons. We don't have a lot of great observations over Africa. So it's a little. I think had we had better observations, that would help a bit. Better signals for stuff forming right off the coast of Africa. I think it's a little. You can get a lot from satellites, but there is certainly still value from having weather stations and also, especially weather balloons, make a big difference. Getting those exact measurements at specific elevations in the atmosphere, and we just don't have many over Africa. I think if we had more over Africa, that might help with forecasting some of these. Whether a system's going to come off Africa and die, or it's going to, become a Hurricane Irma, say.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't imagine being in your position in your team and looking at it's a good thing you're the scientist and you have all the experience and in our highlights.
But it's one of those things where I've been doing this for 24 years now, and still it's like there's times where you just shrug your shoulders and you're like, I really don't know. People are like, oh, is it going to get busy? And I'm like, I think so, but I really don't know. Like, it's not super clear what's going to happen. And, I tend to think the models in general do a good job of forecasting the shear coming up, and the models continue to forecast low shear for the next few weeks. So if you have low shear long enough, something probably strong is going to happen at some point. You won't keep the Atlantic that dry forever. It would be extremely unusual. I mean, obviously, we only have so many years, and I'm sure if you had 1,000 years of data, you would see all sorts of crazy stuff. But it would definitely be something that we had never seen before, to have hot water and low shear for August, September, and October, and not have one or two pretty gnarly hurricanes come out of that. So I think at some point they will come. We've seen really weird stuff. My favorite example is 1961. We had a major hurricane in July, not quite a barrel, but that kind of type of storm. We had 0 storms in August, not one, nothing. And then we had 4 major hurricanes in September. So you never know. Seasons can play out very differently. Not every season's like 2020 where you get, very like storm after storm after storm, one right after the other. There's years where there's decent gaps. So we shall see.
Where can people go if they want to get your updates that you're doing every couple weeks?
Yeah, so we have our website is tropical.colostate.edu. So if you go there, you will find us. So that's where our forecasts are. I do post a fair amount of content also on Twitter about the hurricane season, but our forecasts, we do like for the 2-week forecast, we do a probability of the next 2 weeks being above normal or below. And in those forecasts, we also talk some about the physics as to what's going on. And certainly if we get to September 3rd and the signals are all gone and there's no storms, we'll probably do a pretty more extensive discussion of that and how that might change the outlook for the season. We won't put out a new seasonal outlook, but we might say, hey, September 3rd, we have nothing on the horizon. We may have to, the hyperactive season may not be in the cards, or it may be, hey, it was a quick blip, but now we've got 2 major hurricanes and, all systems back to go. So we shall see.
We shall see. All right. Well, I look forward to checking in with you and seeing how it's going and watching the forecast myself. Thank you very much for joining me and all the information. For those who are listening, I'll include a link to the website that Phil just mentioned in the description, so you can go to that and check out the forecast as they come. I know restorers are always interested in what's happening and if they need to start leveling up or whatever that may be. So, Phil, thank you so much for joining me again. I certainly appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much. Take care.
For more Restoration Today and the latest news, visit our website, cnrmagazine.com, and find the latest episodes of the Restoration Today podcast on your favorite podcasting platform.